The warship hung in the darkness of space like a predator waiting for prey, and Commander Kethvorin stood at the observation window with his 4 eyes fixed on the wreckage floating below. His species had ruled this sector for 10,000 years, and they had never once questioned their right to do so. The Dominion was order, the Dominion was strength, and the Dominion would cleanse the galaxy of all inferior species. The humans were the latest race to fall before their might. "Commander," Lieutenant Urix called from behind him, his voice carrying the flat tone that all Dominion officers used. "The salvage teams have returned from the colony ship." Kethvorin turned slowly, his gray-scaled skin catching the dim light of the command deck, and he allowed himself a small gesture of acknowledgement. What did they find? Primitive technology, personal artifacts, and the remains of approximately 300 humans, Urix reported. Nothing of military value. But there are some items that might interest the cultural archives. The commander walked past his lieutenant without another word and made his way down to the cargo hold. He enjoyed examining the remnants of conquered civilizations because it reminded him of the natural order of things. The Dominion was strong and they were weak. And that was all that mattered in the cargo hold. Several crew members sorted through piles of human belongings with clinical efficiency. There were strange garments made of woven plant fibers, primitive computing devices that ran on chemical batteries, and small photographs showing human faces frozen in expressions. The Dominion had no words for. Kethvorin picked up one of the photographs and studied it with mild curiosity. It showed 2 adult humans and 2 smaller ones, their mouths curved upward in what the cultural database identified as a smile, and they stood before a dwelling made of wood and stone. Inefficient construction. He muttered and tossed the photograph aside. Then something caught his attention in the corner of the hold. A junior officer struggled to open a sealed container that had been pulled from the ship's inner vault. The container was made of a material Kethvorin did not recognize, something that seemed to shimmer with an inner light, even in the cold fluorescent glow of the cargo bay. "What is that?" he demanded. The junior officer looked up with fear in his eyes, because commanders did not often come to the cargo holds, and when they did, usually meant someone had made a mistake. "We do not know, Commander. The container resists our scanning equipment, and we cannot determine what is inside." Kethvorin pushed the officer aside and knelt before the container. His clawed fingers traced the seams until he found a hidden latch that clicked open at his touch. The lid swung back and revealed something that made him pause inside. Resting on a bed of red fabric lay a blade. It was long and slightly curved, forged of layered metal that showed patterns like flowing water, and its handle was wrapped in leather that had somehow survived the centuries. The craftsmanship was undeniably beautiful, even to eyes that had been trained to see beauty only in efficiency and destruction. "A sword," Urix said from behind him, and there was something like amusement in his voice. The humans brought a sword to space. Their attachment to primitive weapons borders on the absurd. Kethvorin should have laughed. His species had abandoned such weapons 10,000 years ago when they discovered energy projectiles and plasma cannons, but he did not laugh. Instead, he reached down and wrapped his clawed hand around the handle. And as his fingers closed on the leather grip, something strange happened. A sensation moved through his chest, something tight and uncomfortable that he had no name for. His heart beat faster, and his breathing grew shallow. And for a brief moment, he felt as though someone was watching him from very far away. He pulled the blade from the container and held it up to the light. The metal gleamed, and he could see his own reflection in its polished surface. But the face that looked back at him seemed different somehow, as though it belonged to someone he did not quite recognize. "Commander?" Urix asked, and now there was concern in his voice. "Are you well?" Kethvorin shook his head to clear it and forced his expression back to neutral. "I am fine," he said, though he was not entirely certain this was true. "I will take this to my quarters. It will make an acceptable trophy." He did not wait for a response, but walked out of the cargo hold with the sword clutched in his hand. Behind him, the crew exchanged glances, but said nothing because questioning a commander was not something anyone did if they wished to remain alive in his quarters. Kethvorn mounted the sword on the wall above his meditation alcove and stood back to examine it. The blade caught the light in ways that seemed almost intentional, and he found himself staring at it for longer than he intended. There was something about the weapon that called to him, something that whispered at the edges of his consciousness in a voice too quiet to understand. He told himself it was fatigue. They had been hunting human ships for months, and the work was exhausting even for a Dominion commander, but as he turned away, he noticed something he had missed before on the blade near the handle. Almost hidden by the leather wrapping, there was an inscription etched into the metal. The characters were in a human language his translation implants could read, and when he processed the words, a chill ran down his spine. "To whomever is worthy." What did that mean? Worthy of what? He dismissed the question and prepared for sleep. But that night his dreams were strange and troubled. He saw faces he did not recognize, felt emotions he had no names for, and heard voices calling out to him in languages that his implants could not translate when he woke. The sword was glowing faintly in the darkness of his quarters. Kethvorn stared at it for a long time, and somewhere deep inside him, in a place his species had tried to destroy generations ago, something began to wake up. 3 weeks passed, and Commander Kethvorn was no longer the same officer who had pulled that sword from the human wreckage. The changes came slowly at first, small things that only he noticed. He would pause in the middle of giving orders, distracted by sounds that no one else could hear, and he would stare at the blade on his wall for hours, convinced that it was trying to tell him something important. The whispers grew louder every day. They came to him in his sleep and followed him into his waking hours. Voices speaking in rhythms and tones that felt ancient and powerful. His translation implants worked constantly to decode the sounds, but they always failed, leaving him with impressions rather than words, feelings rather than meanings. "Commander, the human settlement on Kepler 7 awaits your order," Lieutenant Urix reported one morning on the command deck. "The orbital bombardment is ready. We need only your authorization to begin the cleansing." Kethvorn sat in his command chair and stared at the planet spinning slowly on the view screen. It was a small world covered in blue oceans and green forests, and somewhere on its surface, 3 million humans went about their daily lives without knowing that death hung above them. He had given this order 100 times before. He had watched worlds burn and felt nothing but satisfaction at a job well done. The cleansing of inferior species was the sacred duty of the Dominion, and he had always believed in that duty with every fiber of his being. But now his hand would not move. "Commander?" Urix asked, and there was confusion in his voice because Kethvorn had never hesitated before. The whispers grew louder, and Kethvorn closed his eyes. Behind his eyelids, he saw images that made no sense. A human child running through a field of yellow flowers. An old man teaching a young one how to shape wood with his hands. 2 humans pressing their mouths together in what the database called a kiss. He felt something twist in his stomach, and his throat grew tight. "Commander, are you unwell?" Kethvorn opened his eyes and looked at his lieutenant, and for a moment he did not recognize the face before him. Urix looked like a stranger, like something cold and hollow that had never known warmth. "Delay the bombardment," Kethvorn heard himself say. "I wish to review the tactical situation further." The bridge fell silent, and every officer turned to look at their commander with shock in their eyes. In 10,000 years of Dominion history, no commander had ever delayed a cleansing order. "Commander," Urix began carefully, "the tactical situation is clear. The humans have no defenses capable of threatening our ship, and High Command has ordered their elimination. There is nothing to review. I said delay it. Keth Varn snapped, and his voice echoed across the bridge with an intensity that surprised even him. Eric's took a step back and nodded slowly. As you command. Later that day, Keth Varn returned to his quarters and found himself standing before the sword without remembering how he got there. The blade had begun to glow more frequently now. A soft golden light that pulsed like a heartbeat. He reached out and touched the metal. And the moment his fingers made contact, the whispers became aurora images, flooded his mind faster than he could process them. He saw a human soldier falling in battle, but refusing to let go of the comrade he was trying to save. He saw a mother going without food so her children could eat. He saw an old woman planting a tree she would never live to see grow, and he felt what they felt. The soldier's love for his friend burned like fire in Keth Varn's chest. The mother's sacrifice made his eyes sting with a strange wetness. The old woman's hope for the future generations filled him with a longing he could not name. He pulled his hand away and stumbled back, his breathing ragged and his heart pounding. What was happening to him? The door chimed, and he quickly composed himself before granting entry. Ship Physician Thrall stepped inside and offered the traditional Dominion salute. Commander, Lieutenant Urix has expressed concern about your health. He requested that I examine you. There is nothing wrong with me, Keth Varn said. But even he could hear the lack of conviction in his voice. Thrall was old for their kind, nearly 400 years. And she had served on Dominion warships long enough to know when someone was lying. With respect, Commander, the crew has noticed changes in your behavior. You speak to yourself when you think no one is watching. You have refused 3 direct orders from High Command. And last night you released 2 human prisoners from the detention cells. Keth Varn froze. He had forgotten about the prisoners. He had gone to the cells intending to interrogate them, but when he saw their faces, something had broken inside him. They had looked at him with such fear, such desperate hope that he might show them mercy. And he had found himself unable to do anything except open the cell door and tell them to run. That was a tactical decision. He lied. They possessed information that, Commander, Thrall interrupted gently. I have run scans on you remotely during the past week. Your neural patterns have shifted dramatically. There is activity in regions of your brain that have been dormant for generations. Regions that the founders suppressed in our genetic code when they engineered our species for conquest. She paused and looked at the sword on the wall, her 4 eyes narrowing. It started when you took that blade, did it not? Keth Varn said nothing because there was nothing to say. The founders removed certain traits from our species because they considered them weaknesses. Thrall continued. Empathy, compassion, guilt, love. These emotions interfered with the efficiency of conquest, so they were eliminated through genetic manipulation. But they were not destroyed, merely suppressed. She stepped closer, and her voice dropped to a whisper. That sword is waking something up inside you, Commander. Something our people have not felt in 10,000 years. Keth Varn looked at the blade and then back at the physician. What do I do? Thrall shook her head slowly. I do not know. But I know this. If High Command learns what is happening to you, they will have you executed as a genetic defective. You must be careful, Commander. Very careful. She left without another word. And Keth Varn stood alone in his quarters, with the sword glowing softly on the wall. The whispers continued. And for the first time in his life, he did not want them to stop. The message from High Command arrived on a cold morning, while Keth Varn stood at the observation window, watching stars drift past like scattered diamonds. Commander, Urix announced from the communication station, his voice tight with barely concealed worry. Priority transmission from the Dominion Council. They are sending a delegation to our ship. Keth Varn did not turn around. He had been expecting this for days, Now his defiance had not gone unnoticed. He had refused to destroy the human settlement on Kepler 7. He had released prisoners. And he had begun questioning orders in ways that no Dominion officer ever should. The Council would want answers. And Kethvarm was not certain he had any that would satisfy them. When will they arrive? 12 standard hours, Commander. They are bringing warrior priests from the Temple of Obedience. That name sent a chill through his body. The warrior priests were the most elite soldiers in the Dominion, genetically engineered to be absolutely immune to weakness of any kind. They existed for one purpose: to eliminate threats from within. Understood, Kethvarn said quietly. Prepare the ship for their arrival. He returned to his quarters and stood before the sword. And the blade seemed to sense his turmoil because it glowed brighter than ever before. The whispers were constant now, a chorus of voices that spoke of courage and sacrifice and something the humans called hope. Kethvarn had searched the Dominion database for that word and found only a brief definition that described it as an irrational belief in positive outcomes, despite evidence to the contrary. But that definition felt wrong somehow. The hope he felt from the sword was not irrational. It was a force that had carried the human species through darkness and suffering. A light that refused to be extinguished no matter how terrible the circumstances. He reached out and took the blade in his hands. And immediately the visions came. He saw a human city under siege, its defenders vastly outnumbered by enemies who wanted nothing more than to destroy them. He watched as ordinary humans, farmers and teachers and craftsmen, picked up weapons they barely knew how to use and stood against impossible odds. They knew they would likely die. They fought anyway. Saw a human healer working through the night to save wounded soldiers, her hands steady even though her heart was breaking. He saw children sharing their meager food with strangers. He saw old enemies setting aside their hatred to face a common threat. And he understood something that shook him to his core. The humans were not weak. They had never been weak. Their emotions, the feelings that the Dominion had systematically eliminated from their own species, were not liabilities. They were the source of a strength that the Dominion could not comprehend. Love gave humans something to fight for. Hope kept them going when logic said they should surrender. Compassion bound them together into communities that could withstand any hardship. The Dominion had mistaken these things for weaknesses because they could not understand them. And in their arrogance, they had tried to conquer a species that possessed power they could not measure with any scanner or weapon. Voron lowered the sword and looked at his reflection in the blade. He barely recognized himself anymore. His eyes had changed, softened somehow, and the cruel set of his jaw had relaxed into something that almost resembled kindness. He was becoming something new, something that had not existed in the Dominion for 10,000 years, and he was terrified. But beneath the terror, there was something else, a warm glow in his chest that told him he was on the right path. The sword seemed to pulse with approval, as if congratulating him for finally understanding. The 12 hours passed faster than Kethvarn expected. And before he knew it, the delegation ship was docking with the Eternal Conquest. He walked to the hangar bay to meet them. And he brought the sword with him. Erix walked at his side. And the lieutenant's face was a mask of barely controlled fear. Commander, are you certain this is wise? The warrior priests will see the blade as a contamination, a threat to Dominion purity. Let them see what they will, Kethvarn replied. I am done hiding. The hangar doors opened, and the delegation entered. There were 12 warrior priests in total, each one standing nearly 8 feet tall, their bodies encased in ceremonial armor that had been blessed by the founders themselves. At their head walked High Priest Varax, the most feared of all the temple's leaders. His 4 eyes glowed with a cold fire, and his voice echoed like thunder when he spoke. Commander Kethvarn, you have been accused of betraying the sacred mission of the Dominion. You have shown mercy to inferiors, questioned the righteous orders of High Command, and allowed your genetic purity to become compromised by an alien artifact. He pointed one clawed finger at the sword. You will surrender that weapon and submit to judgment. Cathvorin looked at the 12 warriors arrayed before him, each one capable of killing 100 ordinary soldiers without breaking stride. He looked at his own crew, cowering behind him with terror in their eyes, and then he did something no Dominion officer had done in 10,000 years. He refused. No. The word hung in the air like a thunderclap. And for a long moment, no one moved or spoke. What did you say? Varax demanded, and his voice was ice and venom. I said no. Cathvorin repeated, and his hand tightened on the sword's handle. This blade is not a contamination. It is a gift, a window into something our species lost long ago. I will not surrender it, and I will not submit to your judgment. Varax's eyes narrowed, and he gestured to his warriors. Then you will die, and we will take it from your corpse. The warrior priests advanced, their weapons humming with deadly energy. And Cathvorin knew that he had no chance of surviving the next few minutes, but he did not run. He stood his ground and held the sword before him. And as the first warrior priest reached out to strike him down, something miraculous happened. The blade began to glow. The light that erupted from the blade was unlike anything the Dominion had ever witnessed. It was not the harsh glow of plasma, weapons, or the cold gleam of starlight. It was warm, impossibly warm, and it pulsed with colors that had no names in any Dominion language. The first warrior priest stumbled backward as the light washed over him, and his weapon clattered to the floor as his hands flew to his head. Then he screamed. It was a sound that no Dominion had made in 10,000 years. A cry of pure anguish that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than the throat. And as the light continued to spread, the other warrior priests began to scream as well. High Priest Varax raised his arms to shield himself, but the light passed through them as if they were not there. It touched his face, and his eyes went wide, wider than Cathvorin had ever seen, and the cold fire that had burned in them flickered and went out. What is this? Varax gasped, and for the first time in his long life, there was fear in his voice. What are you doing to us? But Cathvorin was not doing anything. He simply held the sword and let its power flow outward, like a river breaking through a dam, and then the visions began. Every living being in the hangar bay was pulled into the light, and they saw what Cathvorin had been seeing for weeks. They saw through human eyes, felt with human hearts, lived human lives from beginning to end in the space of a single heartbeat. They saw a young human girl sitting beside the bed of her dying grandmother, holding the old woman's hand and singing softly to ease her passing. They felt the grief that filled the child's heart, and they felt the love that made the grief bearable. They saw a human man diving into a frozen river to save a stranger's child, knowing that the cold might kill him but unable to stand by and do nothing. They felt his terror and his determination, the way his body screamed for him to stop while his heart demanded that he keep going. They saw soldiers writing letters to their families before battle, pouring their love onto paper because they might not have another chance. They saw parents working 3 jobs so their children could have a better life. They saw teachers staying late to help struggling students. They saw neighbors rebuilding each other's homes after disasters. They saw 1,000 acts of kindness, sacrifice, and courage, each one small on its own, but together forming a tapestry of such overwhelming beauty that the warrior priests could not bear to look away, and they felt what the humans felt. Love hit them like a physical force, a warmth that spread through their bodies and reached into the cold, empty places where their emotions should have been. For the first time in their engineered existence, they understood what they had been missing. Grief came next, wave after wave of sorrow for losses they had never experienced, and they wept without understanding why. The tears burned their eyes because Dominion tear ducts had atrophied from disuse. But they could not stop them from falling hope, filled them with a longing so intense it was almost painful, a desperate wish for something better, something more than the endless cycle of conquest and destruction that had defined their entire civilization and guilt. That crushing weight that Kethvorin had carried for weeks descended on all of them at once. They saw the worlds they had burned, the species they had exterminated, the countless billions of lives they had ended in the name of Dominion purity. But now they saw those lives not as statistics or objectives, but as people, real people, with hopes and dreams and families who loved them. The warrior priests collapsed to their knees, their armor clanking against the hangar floor, and their screams faded into sobs. Even Vorax, the most hardened of them all, crumbled before the onslaught of emotion. "Make it stop," one of the priests begged, his voice broken and raw. "Please, make it stop." But Kethvorin could not stop it, and he was not sure he would have even if he could. This was the truth that the Dominion had been hiding from itself for 10,000 years. And it needed to be seen. The light continued to pour from the sword, and the visions continued to flow. They learned the history of the blade itself. It had been forged a millennium before humanity reached the stars, shaped by a master craftsman who had poured his soul into the metal. It had been carried by warriors and poets, kings and peasants, each one leaving a piece of themselves behind. Every prayer whispered over its edge, every tear shed while holding its hilt, every moment of courage and compassion had been absorbed into the steel. The sword was not just a weapon. It was a repository of everything that made humanity what it was, and now it was sharing that treasure with beings who had been designed to be incapable of receiving it. The founders had thought they were creating the perfect soldiers by removing emotion from the Dominion genome. They had believed that feelings were weaknesses to be eliminated, obstacles to efficiency that served no purpose, but they had been catastrophically wrong. The humans had crossed the void between stars, not because they were efficient, but because they dreamed. They had survived wars and plagues and disasters not because they were logical, but because they loved each other too much. To give up emotion was not weakness. It was the engine that drove a species to greatness. The light began to fade, and the visions slowly released their grip on the warrior priests. One by one, they lifted their heads and looked around with eyes that had been fundamentally changed. They saw their own hands, the claws that had torn apart so many innocent lives, and they shuddered with revulsion. "What have we done?" Varax whispered, and his voice was that of a child waking from a nightmare. "What have we become?" Kethvorin lowered the sword and looked at the 12 warriors kneeling before him. They were no longer enemies, no longer hunters sent to destroy him. They were something new, something that had not existed in the Dominion since the time before the founders. They were awake and they were horrified. The hangar bay was silent, except for the soft sounds of weeping, a sound that had not been heard on a Dominion warship in 10,000 years. Kethvorin stood in the fading light of the sword, watching the 12 warrior priests struggle to comprehend what had just happened to them. Their faces, which had been masks of cold certainty only minutes ago, now showed confusion and fear and something else. Something that looked almost like wonder. High Priest Varax rose slowly to his feet, and when he looked at Kethvorin, there was no anger in his eyes, only a profound and terrible sadness. "We came here to kill you," he said, and his voice cracked on the words. "We came here to destroy that blade and purge the weakness from our ranks. We were so certain, so absolutely certain that we were right." He looked down at his clawed hands. "How many have I killed? How many worlds have I helped destroy? I cannot even count them anymore. They were just numbers to me, statistics and reports that I filed without a second thought." Tears fell from his 4 eyes, and he made no move to wipe them away. But they were not numbers. Were they? They were people, real people with lives and loves and hopes. And we ended them all because we thought we were superior. One of the other warrior priests let out a howl of anguish and fled the hangar bay, his armor clanking as he ran. Another followed him, and then another, until nearly all of them had scattered in different directions. They were not running from Kethvorin or the sword. They were running from themselves, from the weight of what they had done and what they had become. Only Varax remained, standing before Kethvorin with his shoulders slumped and his head bowed. What happens now? The high priest asked. Do we simply return to high command and pretend this never happened? Do we continue the cleansing wars as if we have not been fundamentally broken? Kethvorin considered the question carefully. The sword had grown quiet in his hands, its golden glow fading to a soft shimmer that warmed his palms without burning them. I do not think any of us can go back to what we were, he said finally. The door has been opened and it cannot be closed. We have seen the truth, and no amount of willpower can make us unsee it. Then what do we do? Kethvorin looked at the sword, and for a moment he could have sworn he saw faces in the polished metal. Thousands of faces stretching back through centuries of human history. They were watching him, waiting to see what he would do with the gift they had given him. We carry them forward, he said. And the words felt right. The humans who gave their lives to create this blade. The billions we have killed in our wars of conquest, all of them. We carry their memory, and we use it to change our people. Varax shook his head. The Council will never allow it. They will hunt us down and destroy us before we can spread this contamination to others. Perhaps, Kethvorin agreed, but the 12 of you will scatter to the far corners of the Dominion. You will carry what you have learned to others, and they will carry it further still. This is not a disease that can be quarantined, Varax. It is a truth, and truth is a way of spreading no matter how hard you try to contain it. The high priest looked at him for a long moment, and then a strange expression crossed his face. Something that might have been the beginning of a smile. You have become something new, Kethvorin. You are no longer Dominion, not truly. I do not know what you are becoming, but I think the humans would have a word for it. What word? Varax considered. I believe they would call it human. He offered the traditional Dominion salute, but this time there was warmth in the gesture, respect freely given rather than demanded. I will do as you say. I will carry this truth to others and let it spread where it will. Perhaps in 100 years, perhaps in 1,000, the Dominion will finally understand what we learned here today. He turned and walked toward the hangar door, but paused at the threshold. What will you do? Kethvorin looked down at the sword, and he thought about the human settlement on Kepler 7, the 3 million lives he had been ordered to destroy. They were still there, still waiting to learn their fate. I will protect them, he said, for as long as I can with whatever strength I have left. It is not much, but it is a start. Varax nodded once and disappeared through the door. Leaving Kethvorin alone in the hangar bay, he stood there for a long time, holding the sword and feeling its warmth spread through his body. The whispers had faded to a gentle murmur, voices offering comfort and encouragement rather than visions and demands. Thank you, he said to the blade. And though he felt foolish speaking to a weapon, he could not help himself. I do not know why you chose me, but I will try to be worthy of the gift you have given. The sword pulsed once, a final burst of golden light that felt like a blessing. And then it fell silent. Kethvorin sheathed the blade and walked toward the bridge. There was work to be done. The cleansing wars would not end overnight, but they would end. The seeds had been planted, and now all he could do was nurture them and hope he had not known that word a month ago. Had dismissed it as irrational foolishness when he first encountered it in the human database. But now he understood why the humans clung to it so fiercely. Hope was not irrational. It was essential. It was the belief that tomorrow could be better than today, that suffering had meaning, that love was worth the pain of loss. It was the force that had driven humanity across the stars. And now it was spreading to a species that had forgotten how to dream. The Bridge doors opened and Lieutenant Erix turned to face him. Fear and uncertainty written across his scaled features. Commander, the warrior priests have departed. What are your orders? Cathvorn sat in his command chair and looked at the view screen, where the stars stretched endlessly into the darkness. Somewhere out there, the scattered priests were beginning their journey, carrying the truth to every corner of the Dominion. Set course for Kepler 7, he said, and his voice was calm and certain. We have people to protect. Erix stared at him for a long moment, and then something shifted in the lieutenant's eyes. A tiny spark of something that might have been understanding. Yes, Commander. The ship hummed to life around them, and Cathvorn allowed himself a small smile as they turned toward the distant human world. The Dominion had thought that emotions were weaknesses to be eliminated. They had believed that efficiency and cold logic were the highest virtues. They had tried to build an empire on a foundation of emptiness, but the humans had shown them a different truth. The greatest strength was not the ability to destroy, it was the courage to care, and as the eternal conquest accelerated toward its new mission, Cathvorn felt the sword at his side, warm and alive with the memory of 1 billion human souls who had carried it before him. They had trusted him with their legacy, and he would not let them down.